So what I'd like to do is just start off. Tonight we're going to have Riley and Mark's here to talk about our parkways and boulevards. And the reason that I think we thought about, the reason we decided to do this was that we all love the parkways and boulevards, but we may not know the intricacies that are involved in parkways as opposed to parks themselves. But parkways are designated and they're part of the Denver Parks and Rec, and I'll let Mark correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the, under the umbrella of Denver Parks and Rec. And you have already read, we have 35 parkways, and we have in 2005 that were designated, and we have about 62 miles or more, and I also may be corrected on some of that. They're wonderful connections. The early fathers of our city wanted to connect north, south, east, and west with parkways, and unfortunately, the west one was never completed. And so, but they had a vision of how it would elevate the streets, elevate the city, and connect parks and communities. So they're really, really important. I would like to encourage you, and I don't know if you guys can see me because I can't see myself, but this design guidelines that was developed by the Mundus Bishop Group in 2005. It talks about Denver's designated parkways and boulevards, and I really encourage you to go online and look at this. It's fascinating. It's about 20 pages, and it has a lot of good information on it, historical information that I didn't know about it and learned a lot from it. So without further ado, so to speak, I'd like to turn this over to Riley, who's the senior city planner at DOTI, and we came up with some questions about how does Parks and Rec and DOTI work together, and who else might, but how do they work together in taking care of our parkways? So Riley, I'm going to open it up to you.
Cindy, can I interrupt for just
please.
a moment?
Oh, please do, Mark.
Yeah,
Anything
you did a great intro, and that the parkway system is a cherished part of our parks and recreation system, as you mentioned, and I just wanted to kind of introduce how we might proceed with the meeting tonight to give you a little background, because the good news is that the Denver parkways are part, of course, as you all know, a part of a wider street system, and the relationship between Parks and Rec and DOTI, and DOTI has reorganized itself with a great commitment around mobility, and are developing that Riley will tell you more about, a complete street design guidelines for all streets, including parkways as a subsetting, and including the idea of contemporary parkways. It's really a great time for the agencies to be working together, and for the commitment that we have as a city and as a department to preserve our historic parkways, but also to rethink parkways in a contemporary context. We're at a point where we think that that's a good step forward. So what Riley has is a quick presentation of the work that's been happening on these complete street design guidelines, again, including historic parkways, but also all of our streets. And he'll do a little bit of background on the great work that we've been doing interagency, but that, led by DOTI, some of their progress. And then I thought we could go into the questions that you shared with us specifically, because we'll have a little bit better context for that at that point. So is that an okay way to proceed?
Certainly, certainly.
And Riley, thank you very much for making the time. Are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, I will. Let's see. It is saying host disabled participant screen sharing. If there's a way to make me a co-host, I think I can share my screen.
Yeah.
Maggie will work on that. But
Okay.
so shall we just, if you've got something while she's opening that up?
Yeah. Well, so first, thanks again, both Cindy and Mark, for the introduction. You know, that's why we're here together, because you know, the Denver's Parkway system and Boulevards are assets to both DOTI and Parks and Recreation, and that's why we're here together as a team tonight. And so I'm really excited to kind of share with you what we know. I'm certainly not an expert on parkways, but we'll happy to follow up on any questions that you might ask that I'm not able to answer. And let's see if I can share screen. Still not letting me do it. But maybe what we could do while we're waiting for that to get set up is just simply to start with one of the questions that you guys had.
Okay. Well, you know what? I'm going to throw out one that wasn't in there. But so, what are some of the responsibilities that DOTI has for parkways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'll start with that, and then just from the DOTI perspective. So we definitely have, it's a shared responsibility between Parks and DOTI, and as well as other partners that are in there too in terms of the maintenance. So for example, Parks and Recreation maintains the medians as well as the any of the landscape features that are inside of parkways, whereas DOTI will maintain the paving, we maintain the signals and striping, any signage, that kind of thing, we maintain all of that. And then obviously the adjacent property owner most often maintains trees as well as the sidewalks. So the maintenance responsibilities are really kind of shared across all parts of the city. But sometimes it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because some of our parkways also are on CDOT owned roads. So in that case, that responsibility falls on CDOT. In some cases, there are parkways that are in business improvement districts, and those are special districts that have the ability to provide additional maintenance beyond what the city does. And so I say all that to say that it's not black and white when it comes to maintenance. There's definitely a lot of shared responsibilities when it comes to that. So.
Yeah, and I might add that adjacent owners have a big part of the role and responsibility for maintenance along our designated parkways. Some of our tree lawns are the trees in those tree lawns, I think, are mostly uniformly overseen and maintained by our forestry division on most parkways. On some of those parkways and throughout the city, street trees are on public right-of-way, but are relegated or are the adjacent owners are asked to maintain those trees in the public right-of-way, and forestry will oversee that they are properly being taken care of by those private owners. So, and there's also a setback requirement, which is actually a setback from the right-of-way back on private property, that controls and prescribes what kinds of improvements. Really, it precludes intrusions like solid fences and other structures, and it encourages landscape. So, this, our the roles and responsibilities for preserving our historic parkways really are this shared responsibility of private owners that live along the city, both the DOTI for the hardscape and Parks and Rec for much of the softscape, and Landmark. Our Landmark Commission also has an interest, as those are part of our locally designated landmarks. So as they are many of our designated parkways, not all, but some are also on the National Register. So that's a little bit of background on kind of who participates and who has responsibility.
Thank you. Riley, your screen share is up.
Perfect. All right. So that, I'm glad that we were able to kind of discuss the maintenance question and who shares responsibility, and that was a little bit later in the presentation, and so now I can say that we've covered it. So, but I do want to give you guys a little bit of background just in history of Denver's parkways. A lot of this information is actually in the parkway guidelines that you mentioned earlier that were developed in 2005. But just to sort of reiterate that, you know, as we said earlier, there's 35 parkways that have been designated in Denver that were really intended to be tree-lined streets that are extensions of parks and provide some of those same park-like amenities. And really, the vision came a long time ago and as an intention to be able to connect parks in Denver with civic destinations. Something that I want to touch on is that the vision for these parkways started as early as the 1870s, with the construction of Park Avenue as being one of the earliest ones. And so this vision for parkways is something that's over 150 years old, which I think is really neat, especially to just think from someone who's a city planner. I really find that wonderful that that vision is still going and that we're talking about it today and how we can continue to keep that legacy and carry that legacy forward of Denver's parkways. So some of the, just to kind of as a reminder of what characterizes a parkway, usually these are things such as a spacious or really wide tree lawn that either has vegetation in it or grass or lots of trees. In addition, most of the time on a parkway, the buildings or the houses will be further set back on the street or further set back from the street as a way to really kind of expand that park-like feeling. You'll oftentimes also see planted medians as well. This is an example of 7th Avenue Parkway where you can see that planted median there. And then final defining feature is oftentimes gateway features. And so when I say that, I'm referring to, if you think of like City Park, Esplanade, there are statues and sculptures that sort of provide this gateway feeling to connect that street into the park. And so those were, again, all features of these parkways. And as you've probably noted, depending on which parkway you've been to or any time that you traveled in Denver, that there's a lot of different examples and they're all different in character. So you'll notice one of the ones I have on my screen first is Monaco Parkway. And that one has a lot of the similar characteristics in that it has a planted median, it has a really wide tree lawn, but parts of it either don't have sidewalks or they have really narrow sidewalks in comparison to, let's say, East 17th Avenue Parkway, which is the one that's in the middle of my screen, and where that one does have sidewalks that are detached from the main road and separated by a nice tree lawn. And then you move on and we have other examples like Spear, where definitely a lot different in character from the other two. These carry a lot more vehicles and are completely separated from each other on the roadway. And so just kind of pointing this out to share, as you guys are all aware, that there's definitely, depending on what parkway you're at, the character definitely changes on these. As Mark mentioned earlier, when we talk about parkways and boulevards, there's definitely a lot of agency coordination that occurs And even more so now, now that we are reorganized from Public Works into DOTI. So about 2 years ago, we started making the transition from Public Works into DOTI, and then that became official last year when it was voted for, or when it was voted on by Denver voters. And in that time, during that organization, I do want to say that definitely the amount of coordination between agency to agency has only increased during that time. So, oftentimes as a department, we have projects that help us to meet our goals of moving more people in the city and making our streets safer. And oftentimes those projects overlap with parkways. And so anytime that those projects do overlap, we will coordinate with the Parks and Recreation Department to make sure that the goals of both agencies are being met. An example of this is Spear Boulevard is technically a parkway, but there's also a plan that recognizes the potential to have transit, dedicated transit service in the future. And that's a plan that's called Denver Moves Transit. And so those are areas where we're trying to coordinate on to both meet the goals of Spear as a parkway and as a boulevard, but then also be able to meet our goal of being able to move more people through our city and do that safely. Other examples where we've coordinated are on bikeway projects. We've also been coordinating on in cases where we're trying to improve parkways that don't have sidewalks and expand new detached sidewalks. And that's something that Parks has been supported us on as we've coordinated. And Mark, feel free to jump in, or if you have anything else that you want to add on these.
You're doing great.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, for both the agencies, parkways are incredibly important assets to our city and to the community. And speaking at least on behalf of DOTI, they're important to us as well. And those are for some of the reasons that I've outlined on the screen. But I'll start with for reasons of safety. Parkways such as thinking about like 7th Avenue Parkway, where there's this really amazing tree lawn and vegetation. Those kinds of streets have the ability to encourage slower speeds. Typically, we find streets where there's a greater tree canopy and there is more plantings and more of this park-like setting. We will typically find that speeds are slower. And when speeds are slower, that means that they're safer. They also are an asset to us because they encourage active transportation. So again, just the comfort level there, the amount of trees and vegetation encourages people to bike and walk on them. So that helps us with our goals of being able to move more people in our city. And then finally, these are important from both a stormwater mitigation strategy as well as a climate mitigation strategy. So these are really important for a number of reasons.
And of course, our historic legacy,
Yes.
which is one of the primary drivers of the progressive era and really of the growth and expansion at the turn of the century of our park system in Denver.
Absolutely. So one thing I did want to mention is, while we look at how our parkways are functioning today, there's certainly both challenges and opportunities that we're presented with. As I mentioned before, there are certain parkways that were built without sidewalks, and so working to find ways to be able to incorporate those in the future, or work with communities to determine if it's appropriate to add sidewalks to some of the historic parkways. Another issue that we sometimes run into is some of the major large arterials that run through the city, like Federal or Colorado or even Spear, are identified as parkways or boulevards, but because of the amount of vehicles and traffic that we see on the streets and just because of their width, those are also the same streets that we see a lot of crashes happen, whether that be vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to bicycle, or vehicle to pedestrian. And so those some of these streets actually align with what is called our high injury network. And that means streets that are identified as having a high proportion of crashes occur on them. And so that, as we work to improve safety in our city, a lot of these streets that we're focused at from a safety perspective and trying to make improvements on these streets so that they are safer and that we're reducing the number of crashes on them. And this is something that is called Denver's Vision Zero program. And this is a kind of a philosophy at the city that zero is the only number of acceptable traffic deaths in our city, and that people should be able to safely get from point A to B. And the number of crashes has gone up, unfortunately, especially in the last 5 years or so. And so this is something that we're really working to improve, is to improve safety again. So those are some of the challenges that we see on some of these larger arterials. And again, some of those are also the same streets that are identified as parkways or boulevards. The final challenge, and I know Mark can speak to this a little bit more, and there were some questions about this, but some of the streets that were identified as parkways or boulevards, Colorado and Federal being one of those, or two of those streets, didn't fully reach their potential as parkways. And so there's, I think, some thinking about how we can potentially still meet that vision in the future. And Mark, I might let you kind of touch on this a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Riley. The Colorado in particular, and portions maybe south of 20th on Federal were never improved as the other historic parkways were, with the tree lawns and the medians, as many of our other historic parkways were. And of course, during the 40s and 50s, and as traffic increased, those avenues in particular, those arterials were expanded to the point where the right-of-way, the street edge almost matches the right-of-way. In other words, there's no right-of-way for tree lawns. There's very little right-of-way for even sidewalks along some of these areas. So the fact that they were never improved as parkways, really made it difficult, and makes it difficult in contemporary terms, to preserve them as parkways, since they never had those attributes to begin with. We're going to be starting this year a review and a planning process to look at all of our historic parkways, and to look at potentials for expanding our parkway system, and maybe redefining those parkways that we're not able to manage as parkways, and maybe make appropriate adjustments. But I think we see the opportunity to expand the idea and the contemporary interpretation of parkways more widely in the city than where we have limited parkways today. We want to commit to all the parkways that we have designated, particularly the ones that retain the ability to preserve them as historic parkways. But we want to expand that idea as well. So we're excited about this planning process, and we'll be looking at Colorado and at South Federal for options of how they can continue to improve, even if they are not managed as parkways in the future.
Great, thanks for that, Mark. That's really good update on that. We touched on this earlier, but just again to touch back on who maintains parkways, as you can see here, it's definitely not black and white. There's many parties that are involved in maintaining parkways, but also just in any street in general. It's not just one entity, and so this slide just really shows that there is a lot of involved parties depending on part of the street that we're discussing. So one thing I do want to make a plug on is I mentioned earlier, DOTI is currently involved in something that is called the Complete Street Design Guidelines that helps us to be able to guide street design in the future. And included in that is the design of parkways as well as a subset of contemporary parkways. And so I just wanted to touch on this really quick, just to kind of provide some context for that. I know one of the questions is, how can we potentially expand our contemporary parkway or our parkway system? And these guidelines are going to sort of set a framework for being able to do that in the future. So that's why I just wanted to touch on this a little bit. So DOTI is in the process of developing street design guidelines. These are going to be released for public review in a couple of weeks from now. This is a process that's been going on for about 9 months, I believe. And these came from the effort, I would say, is actually started in the Blueprint Denver plan. This identified different street types in Denver, just with a need to, we realize that not every street is the same, and that depending on the type of street that, or the context of the street, they have different needs. For example, someone that's on a street like Colfax has very different needs from a pedestrian perspective, or from a bicycle perspective than say a more industrial street. So what we did was we tried to break all of the streets in Denver into different types of streets depending on their surrounding neighborhood context. So that way we can be a little bit more nuanced about how we're thinking about their design. So one example, and I'll go back. So there was 6 different types of streets that were identified in Blueprint, and then in this process, we actually added a couple of additional street types. But what this is giving guidance on is things like making sure that there's enough width for the sidewalk space is adequate, making sure that that adequate room for a tree lawn is thought through, and that it also helps us provide guidance on how do we prioritize things like space for sidewalks versus cafe seating versus the green infrastructure features. And so this is really something that we're excited about. It's new, and I think it will help us to be able to design even better streets in the future. Some of the things, like I mentioned before, it is providing guidance on everything from sidewalk space to the amenity zone to the appropriate curbside uses to guidance on what medians look like if those are used on streets. This is something that has been in the works and is being coordinated between parks and the Community Planning and Development Department, as well as RTD and CDOT. So it's been a citywide, as well as the fire department. So it's been a citywide effort to kind of bring this together. And so I won't spend a ton of time on this part of it, but one of the things that we have explored in this project is the idea of contemporary parkways. And so we recognize that there's a strong desire from the community to expand the parkways from what they are now and be able to extend those, especially in areas of the city that don't have them. And so contemporary parkways look at how knowing the kinds of things that we need to consider today, such as adequate pedestrian space, space for bikes, space for vehicles, space for trees. How do we consider all of those things in the right of way and provide space for them? So we're looking at in this effort, looking at guidance for not only how can we build new parkways in areas of the city that haven't been fully developed, like in the Stapleton area, but also how can we retrofit existing streets and potentially turn those into this more park-like setting as well. So this is something that's being set up in the guidelines, and again, it's providing our guidelines are providing guidance on elements such as the sidewalks, how wide should the space be for the tree lawn, that kind of thing. It's providing guidance on all of those different things. And by having this guidance and having sort of a policy framework for them, again, it allows us to be able to, in the future, designate additional streets as parkways. Well, that also meet today's needs.
And Riley, I might point out that that some good examples of contemporary parkways are found in Lowry and in Stapleton developments of late, where there are contemporary, major contemporary streets within those developments that would qualify to really be identified and preserved as contemporary parkways. And there are a number of neighborhoods throughout the city, as Riley indicated as well, that could be eligible, and streets could be retrofitted to have many of these qualities, and could be preserved to have those qualities of tree-lined streets and of vegetated perimeters, with vegetated medians in many or most cases, and that this is a matter of equity throughout the city. So we're pretty excited about this, and again, we'll be starting that study this calendar year.
Great, thanks, Mark. So just as one additional thing I just want to add real quick is, in our street design guidelines, we oftentimes talk about how, I think this is important on parkways too, is how is space allocated to particularly to pedestrians, and oftentimes there's that space that's given in front of buildings. There's a sidewalk area, and then there's the amenity zone that includes the areas where you would find landscaping or trees, and and any other amenities there. And so we are providing additional guidance on what that looks like, at least in a contemporary parkway. You'll notice here on the bottom that some of that guidance is given there. So that's really everything. I know I went through that really quickly, but that is kind of the presentation that we prepared, and then I wanted to use the rest of the time just so that we can answer any questions. I'm hoping that kind of provided a little bit of a framework and some background information, and then now Mark and I are happy to answer any questions that you might have for us.
And thank you, Mark and Riley, for that presentation. That is excellent. I want to, before we get into questions, I just want to welcome Amber Clark, who is over in the Loretta Heights area. Is that right?
Yeah, next to it in College View.
College View. And also Marlene Johnson. And I'm sorry, Marlene, tell people where you are.
I'm Marlene Johnson, Hutchinson Hills, Willow Point neighborhood, and I'm a delegate for Hutchinson Hills, Willow Point neighborhood.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I am seeing there's comments. Somehow or another, my screen is not working. There is a place to put your hand up on your participants. If you look at the bottom of the participant, thank you. Thank you, Brad. And so first hand up, Brad, you have some questions?
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. I guess, first of all, I'm really thrilled to hear about, the contemporary parkway concept in terms of, additional trees along our roadways and so forth. But I think it's appropriate to kind of look at some of the existing situations outside our current designated parkway system with the issue of who's responsible for maintenance and projecting that forward. And the example I always like to give is Colfax Avenue between Lincoln and Broadway. You know, there's a little tiny median there with a few sad locust trees that have somehow managed to hang on for decades. And I speak from experience because for many years my office looked out over that. And it's one of those areas you just scratch your head and go, now, who is responsible for this? It's certainly not a designated parkway. Presumably it was Public Works. But they're the kind of areas where, you know, they just cry out for maintenance. And I certainly know from Parks' discussions elsewhere, you know, all of that maintenance costs a city agency a lot of money. And, you know, this year is really an issue, and it's always an issue. And so as we move forward, you know, the city has done a masterful job amongst dividing up responsibilities to the adjacent property owners for their portion of the right of way. But, you know, the medians are clearly kind of the question, and we know where to look for undesignated parkways. We know how to get a hold of folks in Park and Rec. But boy, if anyone can figure out in the old Public Works and in the new DOTI who to call on anything, good luck. So as it goes forward into this expansion area, that's to me the big question is who's responsible. And I would jump to the conclusion, and Mark, this may not be Parks and Rec's desire, but you know, Parks and Rec's has the expertise of how to do irrigation systems, how to do that kind of maintenance. And we need to figure out how to get water to our medians so that, you know, these landscaping, these trees we want survive in our increasingly arid and hot climate. So I'd throw that out there as kind of as a question, and also as you go forward with the planning, because the maintenance issue just seems to kind of be always pushed aside. We have beautiful graphics as how it'll look, but you know, somebody's got to water and prune and plant the trees and do all this maintenance, and we need to figure out how to make that work, and Parks is the best entity in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brett. Oh, Cindy, do you mind?
No, please go, because
okay.
I'll ask.
Just real quick. You know, I think part of our study will be looking at what are the appropriate contemporary streets that can be adapted appropriately. And you know, those poor locusts along Colfax in the stretch you mentioned are not to standard, don't have the kind of root zone that they require. You know, I think Colfax is complicated, and correct me if I'm wrong, Riley, I think that's also a state highway. So CDOT has some, you know, purview. So yeah, it's a mess of overlapping jurisdictions. And in the case of some of these forlorn improvements, everybody's pointing at everybody else. So I think the planning process gives us an opportunity to formalize where improvements to the streets can occur in these contemporary, with this contemporary parkway concept, and more formally designate operational and maintenance responsibilities stemming from appropriate streets that can accommodate those improvements.
And thank you, Mark. Riley, the question I heard from Brad, which I would really like for you to address, is who oversees the parkways? Is your organization set up that way that there's people who, if we have questions or would like more information, that we can contact?
Yeah, so I will say, just kind of for context, because I work in the planning division, you know, I'm focused a lot on long-range planning, so I typically am oftentimes not involved in the maintenance itself. So I don't have a contact off the top of my head, but I will gladly follow up with you so that I can find out who the correct person would be. to discuss. I don't know if there's necessarily a person that's overseeing parkways separately, from the way that they would in any other street. But certainly I think it depends on, depending on the type of maintenance concern or maintenance question that you have, I can connect you to that,
So DOTI doesn't have, since they don't manage the portions of parkways outside the roadway, they look at parkways primarily as curb to curb, and so they're looking at them as roadway, and they've got divisions. They've got the city broken up into areas that where their teams are looking at road quality and maintaining those improvements. But Riley's colleagues, I think, are assigned in the planning group, are assigned according to council district, I believe. So there is a DOTI transportation planner that works in each, and I think it focuses in each council district. So
Thank you.
So so Riley, great. I'm sure you can provide the list of folks in the various council districts, if I've got that right.
Yeah, that's right. So we do have community, they're referred to as community designers that work on our engineering team, and they do sort of have as Mark said, they're focused on specific council areas. And so that would probably actually be your best bet.
That would be great. I'm going to move along a little bit because we have some people who have questions. But Riley, if you could get that information to us, we can share that with the people who are attending tonight. Steve, you have a question.
Yeah, I did want to echo concern about, as we add more parkways, the maintenance, and we're certainly a big fan of the parkways and would welcome them all through the city because they do add a lot of beauty. As I think about 6th Avenue Parkway where we live and the comparison with, say, a 7th Avenue Parkway, 7th Avenue Parkway has beautiful plantings in the gateways. They have sidewalks all through, which really facilitates the pedestrian traffic, and they have bike lanes. And when you look at 6th Avenue Parkway between Colorado and Quebec, all of that is absent. So how do we bring the existing parkways up to the same standard while we're still trying to add the additional?
Mark, that might be something that you might address.
Sure. Yeah, I can take a shot at that. We recently have been involved with a bicycle improvement, protected bicycle lane along Marion Parkway, and we spent a long time trying to figure out together with the community how to do that and to preserve the character of the historic parkway. And I think where we have landed and what is I think a reasonable model for other historic parkways is to look at modifications from curb to curb so that the perimeter areas of the parkway and the medians where they exist are preserved, but that maybe where there are 2 traffic lanes, maybe one of those lanes is devoted to a bike lane, and can make that a multimodal experience, which I think parks just conceptually and supports in that parkways were intended for motor travel, but in today's context, we want to make sure they're multimodal. And as Riley mentioned, where they're missing sidewalks, and that's a mobility issue, those are an appropriate addition as well.
Steve, did that help?
I'm not sure that addressed the question, but okay. I understand.
May I ask you, Mark, and just if you can make it real succinct, who in Parks and Rec would a person go to talk about a parkway or a boulevard landscaping? Who would they contact?
You know, I'm the lead in planning for our, you know, administering our parkway regulations and for trying to be a technical consultant on parkway preservation. So
You're the man.
it's me.
You're the man.
It is me. You know, in association with our operations supervisors that actually the crews
Sure.
maintain those
Sure.
those facilities.
Thank you. So you're the man. Jay, are you the person, or Kathleen, whoever has the question?
Okay, there we go.
Okay,
Can you hear us?
Cindy and the group, I have a question. Voters approved a dedicated funding source for Parks and Recreation. And the Parks and Rec Advisory Board has a charter responsibility to offer suggestions and advice on how to appropriate those funds generated from that sales tax. How have you interfaced with Parks and Rec Advisory Board? To what extent are you getting a share of those fundings to support your efforts
Is that for Parkways?
for Parkways?
Thank you. Mark, do you have an answer to that?
Well, offhand, Jay, I
No.
don't have an answer to that, except for that we continue to have conversations with PRAB about priorities for the legacy fund and how you know, how those expenditures are being programmed, how they're being adjusted under you know, COVID-19, and how we're trying to readjust our capital programs to the new reality. But I can certainly look into specifically if there have been some discussions about specific support for parkways.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
And
Maria?
yeah.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Kathleen.
I just also, the question went right out of my brain. Oh, you said earlier you were doing did you say you were doing a study?
Yes.
About
And
Yeah,
I
we're
must have
gonna-
missed it. I think maybe I read it about it earlier if you sent it out in the minutes or the notes. But what's the study?
The study will be evaluating our existing parkway system and looking at all of our designated parkways and making potential recommendations about setbacks. As I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, there are regulations that actually regulate private property adjacent to parkways. Some of those regulations probably need to be revisited, so we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at as we talked about, if there are designated parkways that are not able to be managed as parkways, as we have discussed, and you know, I think Colorado Boulevard is a perfect example. You know, that, you know, should we look at some other designation for them, some other way to manage them so we could manage them appropriately? And in the wider sense, looking again throughout the city for opportunities to expand the idea of tree-lined streets as they would be represented by a contemporary parkway system that could actually designate some additional parkways throughout the city in a contemporary context.
But as we know, the entire thing depends upon enforcement. And we all have seen the horror stories of people that have turned the parkways into rocks, cement, or totally nothing.
Yeah, and I think we will be
And
looking
to add more,
at
to add
at
more
guidelines
without
for
to add more without enforcement, it's really sad. What can we do to encourage people that live on a parkway of their responsibility?
Well, right now we don't have, the regulations don't deal with the landscape design per se of some of those tree lawns and of adjacent private properties, just that they can't be paved or that they can't be they can't have structures built on them, or they can't be fenced off. You know, that's one of the things that we absolutely need and don't have right now, are actual better guidelines and some enforceable regulations as they relate to improvements, particularly in tree lawns, that adjacent private property owners maintain. So, point well taken.
And
Thank
I
you.
guess, and what,
Go ahead.
the last question was, how do people know they have the tree lawn they're responsible for? Does that get communicated when they sell the property? How do they know that they're violating it when they totally rock over it or close it in with concrete? I'm sorry, but that is important because we're adding more without. Okay, you can do what you want. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Mark. Answer about the tree lawn.
No, and I think Kathleen, these are important points that we should be addressing in this revisit. I mean, this is going to be a revisiting of our system and identifying the weaknesses and trying to address how we improve the system that we have and how we expand the system in the future.
Thank you, Mark. That's what I wanted
Mark,
to know.
Good job.
Thank you very
Good job,
much.
Mark.
Thank you.
Mark,
Yes.
I'm going to ask a question, and Maria, I see your hand up. My question is, how are you involving the community in determining in this planning? And Riley, I'm going to ask you the same question about the how are you going to roll out the street types and expect to get community input. So either one of you guys can start off.
Riley, your plan is in progress. Why don't you start?
So I can start with the street design guidelines. So those cover obviously more than just the parkways. Those are all streets in Denver. A lot of it, I'll start with by saying that it's taken the vision that was created through community input from Denver Right and from Blueprint, and then expanded upon that. But we did do additional outreach. So we worked through just to name a couple, we had a stakeholder working group that was met with community members to provide input on the design guidelines. In addition to that, I know we sent out a community survey that was distributed across RNOs, as well as council districts that had questions about the street design guidelines. And beyond that, we've also involved, I know we've done one-on-one meetings, we've done meetings with council members, and then the mayor's pedestrian advisory committee and mayor's bicycle advisory committee. And I'm certainly not touching on everything, but those are some examples of how we've tried to do some outreach and involve the community. We will also be releasing the plan in a couple weeks from now, as I mentioned, that's on our website. We will be releasing that for public input and public comment. So once that is released, I'm happy to share that link with you so that you have that and it can get distributed.
Okay. Thank you.
That's great. In regards to our upcoming Parkways study and plan, I am just starting to write the scope. And so public involvement from the assessment and the inventory level, I think, and all the way through to the recommendation level, we will be looking at a variety of means of making that public through potentially soliciting ideas and suggestions through a survey format, but certainly trying to establish a stakeholder network that will certainly include INC and our other RNOs, and we'll try to make it as broad and as well communicated process as we possibly can under the circumstances.
Thank you. Maria?
Thank you. I have a question about these contemporary parkways. One of the problems is going to be the trees. And I'm looking at the example of the 16th Street Mall. City Council just approved a $90 to $130 million renovation of the 16th Street Mall. And part of that renovation is going to be new trees. And we know new trees mean small trees, but that's because of the 83 original trees in the mall, only 7 are still alive. And when I look at the contemporary parkway design, there's a narrow strip that's called an amenity strip that's right next to the street. And that's where the trees are going to go, along with street lights and I don't know what else, but it's a narrow strip. So
and cell towers.
Responsible for maintaining the trees on the 16th Street Mall. Number 2, what agencies are going to preserve the health of the trees that are planted in these contemporary parkways?
That'll be working with our colleagues in our department in the City Forester's office. And they have developed standards for what is appropriate soil mass and surface dimension for healthy street trees. And you know, granted, street trees are some of the most difficult. I mean, if you wanted to torture a tree, you'd put it in the city. And so they need as much help as they possibly can get. But we would follow, and we would look at and apply standards from our city forester's office in identifying potentials for new investments in contemporary parkways. And right now, as I mentioned earlier, the city forester's office, you know, has a whole crew of inspectors and arborists that monitor trees that are in the public right-of-way, and the health of those trees, primarily the safety of those trees as they relate to, you know, circulation and people walking, but also tree health. And so we have a crew of super talented and super dedicated people in forestry that are helping give us good information and that are monitoring trees citywide. And their goal, above all else, is to increase our canopy. And that was identified in our 2019 game plan, that to get to a higher level of urban forest canopy, and street trees play a huge role in that. As difficult as they are to manage, we have a commitment to it.
Well, let me just ask another question. How do we know that the trees in the contemporary parkways aren't going to suffer the same fate as the trees in the mall?
I'm sorry, I was having a hard time hearing your question.
My question is, how do we know that the trees in the new contemporary parkways aren't going to suffer the same fate as the trees in the 16th Street Mall?
Well, the trees in the 16th Street Mall, you know, had a lot more difficulties, and they were planted. Gosh, when I think when I began my career 35 years ago, those were just being planted, and we've learned a lot. Arborists have learned a lot about how to calculate soil volume and how to build structures around street trees that don't impact their root structure, and there are systems to make that possible. That trees are healthier, and that adjacent structures have integrity. They're called silvacells, or one of the techniques. They're kind of cages that that have holes in them and allow structures to be built close to street trees, but not impact their root structure and to not compact the soil. So we've learned a lot in 35 to 40 years of just my career of how to provide for more healthy trees, and we would apply what we've learned.
Thank you for that. And just one last question, I promise. Are these guidelines, these standards for street trees available online?
Absolutely, absolutely. Go to Parks and Rec and City Forester. You know, to go to the web, and certainly if you have trouble finding them, there's a call-in line for forestry that can guide you right to them.
Appreciate it.
Maggie?
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry.
Oh, who's speaking?
This is Derek Kokovinas. I wanted to, I just recently got in the meeting 15, 20 minutes ago. I've been hearing the discussion. I had a couple of things to add if possible.
Do you have some questions? Yes, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm talking about the Parkway in particular on South Monaco Parkway between at least Alameda and Leedsdale or Exposition. And I have fought for, I don't know, 6 years now with the Division of Forestry to get trees planted. There was a large tree that was taken down when we just moved into the neighborhood in 2014. There was a large tree that was taken down. I had to fight for years to get the Parks and Recreation Department Division of Forestry to plant any trees in its place. And then several trees were planted and then died and replanted, and watering systems were never totally up to speed. And I got nothing but excuses. But if I didn't ride the issue with Division of Forestry and Parks and Recs personnel, nothing ever would have been accomplished. And now my concern is, trees are in and then trees die, or trees are in, and including new trees planted this summer. And the irrigation system isn't necessarily adequate to maintain them. And I, as a homeowner living in the neighborhood, water the trees myself, in addition to the water that's put on from their irrigation system that was supposed to be up and running and perfectly fine by March or April of this year, and never really has been. So if it weren't for contacts with Doug Schock and the like, and Division of Forestry and my own District 5 City Council persons, and our individual involvement and continued emails and questions, nothing would ever be maintained. So I want to make sure things are maintained for the duration, and trees that are planted, are taken care of, keeping an eye on, including summer, winter, etc. There still need to be water. And I question I see the DPS at George Washington High School is, for instance, taking care of those trees daily, watering them daily or every other day, that kind of thing. Those trees are constantly maintained. The trees in the Parkway don't receive that kind of treatment. And I question why that's the case. And if the city or the Parks and Recreation Department or the City Forestry Division of Forestry are not compelled to follow their own guidelines or maintain their own trees, and it comes to individual homeowners and homeowners association to stay on top of them to do that, what happens if they're not getting that feedback from homeowners or neighborhood associations or RNOs? They are going to just say the hell with it. We're not going to maintain anything. To me, the only thing is ever accomplished is through vigilance and constant reminders. And so far, I'm happy with the situations that have, been improved over the last 5 or 6 years. But
I love a happy ending.
I question the idea of the maintenance of the city and county when it comes to parkways versus the DPS and how they handle the same thing.
I can tell you, my colleagues in forestry are some of the most committed people to trees that you will ever meet in your entire life. They cannot ensure the success of every tree in the city, and especially trees in medians are extremely difficult to maintain. You alluded to the irrigation systems brought to the middle of the street and try to be maintained are very difficult, very expensive, and we've got hundreds of miles throughout the city. So again, there is a huge commitment on the part of our forestry staff. I've seen it every day. I appreciate your persistence in bringing things to their attention and to our attention. We do the best we can, but we don't have a 100% success story every time, but we have 100% commitment.
Well, I'd like to, the commitment is fine, and then the follow-up is the other question, and willingness to heed to those suggestions, which, I understand understaffing, maybe antiquated irrigation systems, maybe, priorities being elsewhere, et cetera. But, it's the follow-through that, if it's not forthcoming,
And trees get so much pollution.
I have to remind every day if I need to.
Yeah.
Derek?
I mean, I recognize your frustration, but trees in the median get so much pollution that they're very difficult, a difficult planting environment.
Derek, did you have another question, or was that all you needed to state?
It's the same question. It's just that, it's a lot of talk and not a lot of follow-up, and I'm frustrated by that. Maybe it's a rhetorical question or statement.
Thank you.
Well, it sounds like, that you have gotten response from the forestry supervisor. I know him personally, and again, you'll find nobody that's more committed to healthy trees in the city than Doug.
Well, it's been fantastic.
Derek, maybe one of the things we can have in the future is somebody from forestry to talk about that issue, because I think that there's a lot of medians that are not parkways or boulevards, but they're these tiny little things, and maybe they can shine some light on what their process is and and those kind of questions that you're asking. So I really think that might be a good follow-up in a future meeting. So
yeah, that's a great suggestion, Cindy.
One of the things I've noticed, and I don't know, Maggie, if you can do this, there are 8 comments, and in those comments, I just was wondering, are there any questions that were there or anything like that?
Well, I think that there's one from Wendy, and she would like to hear more about the coordinating between the state and city with regard to Colorado Boulevard. I think we may have answered some of that, but Wendy, do you have any more questions?
Sorry, it took me a minute to figure out how to unmute on my phone. No, I think that answer was provided, sort of. It sounds like it's really difficult. I have to tell you, I'm kind of concerned about hearing that there's some other thought about a different use for Colorado Boulevard, because I kind of like that median and the trees there, and I wish we could figure out a way to make it work. I'd love to be part of that task force, or as a representative of my civic association. We have 3 boulevards that bound our neighborhood. I'll try to reach out to you offline to see if there might be an opportunity for our neighborhood to get a little more involved. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. Brad, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just to follow up on Colorado Boulevard, Mark, I think what alarm bell goes off with me. I mean, obviously Colorado Boulevard doesn't sort of meet the gold standard. It's not like 17th or 6th or 7th Avenue parkways, but boy, it could be a lot worse in the future if you lose the trees that are in the median. And what I am concerned is, and I'm sure those are not easy to maintain, they are, but boy, it would go downhill even more And I hate to say it, but it kind of sounds like Parks is maybe trying to figure out how to foist that off on some other agency of the city. And I would tend to say that should be opposed. Those trees really need a lot of tender care, and they're not going to come from any, DOTI is not going to do it, and certainly CDOT won't. And that's a good example where, it just takes a lot of time and energy, but those trees along Colorado Boulevard and the median are really important.
Oh, I would agree. And, I just today, I denied a development along Colorado because it didn't have the appropriate setback and the appropriate landscape that's identified in the regulation. And the development, the proponent applicant, pointed up and down the street and said, nobody has been held to those standards that you're holding me to. Why are you doing that? So that's what I would like to rationalize. I fully support trying to continue to have a median that's appropriately improved with maintainable landscape. I certainly support that.
We only have 5 minutes, and I would like to make a comment if you don't mind. With equity, I'm hearing interest in Lowry and Stapleton, but our forefathers were thinking about having a parkway to Sloan's Lake to the west that didn't get there. I'm wondering, and I'm going to ask you, it seems like there's a predominance of parkways and boulevards on the east side, but not on the west. And and Riley, this is for you too, but how can we help, or how are we going to get some of the benefits of parkways and boulevards, not necessarily contemporary, but as long as there's lots of trees, over in the west side?
Well, I definitely will invite you all, and maybe I can work through you, Cindy, and the others in INC to try to keep you apprised of our planning effort and to get your input, because that's certainly our objective as well. Is that all neighborhoods in the city deserve to have tree-lined streets, and that serves a citywide environmental value as well as a neighborhood and community amenity value, and encourages people to walk and to bike and to slow down and be safer. So we have an interest in all of those values through this effort.
Yeah. And I have one question.
Good.
I know Cindy mentioned the west side, and I'm glad to hear that, but we do have some parkways, within the northeast side as far as existing in Lowry and also in Stapleton, or whatever its name is now. But what about on the southwest area too? We seem to be really lacking in some treed spaces. I know there's development going on to some extent with Loretta Heights, but what about along Morrison Road? What about Alameda?
And Alameda, we've done some improvements on medians on Alameda, and that's a perfect opportunity for us to build on some of those earlier works, and we're just in the process of building a new rec center along Morrison Road, and would love for Morrison Road to have that kind of status and that kind of investment. So great points.
Thank you.
And we have to leave at 7:30, pardon me. And I want to thank
Time flies when you're having fun.
Oh, it is. It does. And all of our people who came, thank you so much. Thank you for your good questions. I really appreciate that. I thought it would be a shorter presentation, but it's so important. No, and I mean that in the nicest way. I thought that we would have more time to maybe just talk, so we'll look at that for our next meeting. Our next meeting won't be in August, but it'll be in September. And I really want to thank Riley and Mark. You guys did a wonderful job. I feel like we've almost just scratched the surface on Parkways and Boulevards, and would certainly like to hear more about and have participation of people during these processes of defining streets, and also for your committee that you're working on for the parkways, because I think they are so critical.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. And if you wouldn't mind, please share my contact with everybody on the call, and you know, anybody who has a question about parks or parkways. If we didn't get to it tonight, I'm happy to have an offline discussion and try to address any questions that we didn't get to.
Thank you, Riley, and also
Thank you.
thank you, and Riley, thank you again.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me tonight. And again, you're welcome to share my contact information with anything related to streets or questions about the street design guidelines in particular. We're wrapping that up, like I said, but we're still wanting to get input on that. And so again, thanks for having me on tonight.
Thanks, Riley. We'll share both your information and Mark's in our meeting minutes, and we'll also be sharing this particular meeting on our YouTube channel so that other people can see it.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Stay well.
Stay safe. Stay well. And thank you. Good night. I'm going to leave.